Welcome to the True Crime Studio. Today we explore a story of love, ambition, and second chances. 5 years after his divorce, a billionaire CEO finds himself face-to-face with his past in the most unexpected way, forcing him to confront what truly matters in life. If you're ready for a tale filled with drama and redemption, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the True Crime Studio for more captivating stories. Let's dive in.
5 years after his divorce, a billionaire CEO is met with a fierce courtroom battle against the president of a rival company. But one day, as he leaves the courthouse, he freezes in shock when he sees who's at the arm of his rival. Paul Caldwell adjusted his cufflinks as he sat at the defense table, the pristine fabric of his custom suit tailored to perfection. His sharp jawline was set, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail of the courtroom. Across from him, the team from Atlas Innovations murmured among themselves, their high-powered legal counsel shuffling papers in preparation for the day's proceedings. This wasn't Paul's first courtroom battle, but it might be his most critical. The stakes were astronomical, an intellectual property dispute that, if lost, could carve out a significant chunk of Caldwell Enterprises' market dominance. To the untrained eye, he looked calm, almost detached. But beneath the surface, his mind churned like a finely tuned machine, analyzing every possible outcome, every word, every move the opposition might make. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Paul barely noticed the formalities as the attorneys launched into their arguments. His focus was razor-sharp, honed over years of high-stakes business negotiations and battles like this one. He'd built his empire brick by brick, deal by deal, and he wasn't about to let Atlas Innovations, or its smug CEO Marcus Adler, tarnish his legacy. Marcus sat across the room, exuding an air of confidence that Paul found infuriating. They had been rivals for years, circling one another in the corporate world like sharks in the same waters. Today, Marcus seemed particularly self-assured, his smirk just visible as he leaned back in his chair. It wasn't just a case. Something about Marcus' demeanor felt more personal, more pointed than usual. As the lawyers volleyed arguments back and forth, Paul's mind briefly wandered to the whispers of his past that had crept into his thoughts all morning. 5 years had passed since his divorce, and yet, on days like this, it felt as raw as ever. Lauren had been the one person who truly saw him, not just as the billionaire or the titan of industry but as Paul, the ambitious, flawed man underneath. Their marriage had ended not with a single blow but with a slow erosion, the steady wearing away of trust and connection. Paul's relentless pursuit of success had consumed him, leaving little space for Lauren or their life together. He told himself it was for them, that every late night and sacrificed weekend was building a future they could share. But by the time he'd realized his mistake, it had been too late. She'd walked away, and he hadn't stopped her. He couldn't. He didn't know how. The courtroom snapped back into focus as the opposing attorney launched into a blistering argument. Paul's lead counsel leaned over, whispering a strategic rebuttal in his ear. He nodded subtly, gesturing for them to proceed. Despite the complexity of the case, he felt a surge of confidence. Caldwell Enterprises' legal team was the best in the business, and Paul knew the strength of their position. Still, he couldn't ignore the tension coiled in his chest. Winning wasn't just about the case, it was about proving, to himself and everyone else, that he was still at the top of his game. When the court recessed for lunch, Paul lingered in the hallway, his phone in hand but his attention elsewhere. The courthouse buzzed with activity, attorneys and clients shuffling in and out of rooms, their voices blending into a dull hum. He glanced toward the exit, considering a brief escape to his car for some quiet, but something kept him rooted. Marcus Adler strode past him, his entourage in tow. He offered Paul a curt nod, the kind that was more a challenge than a greeting. Paul returned it, his expression unreadable, but his mind raced. He'd seen Marcus play this game before. Confidence was his armor, his weapon. Paul wasn't intimidated. He'd faced down bigger threats than Marcus Adler and come out on top every time. But today, something felt different. There was a weight to this rivalry, an edge that Paul couldn't quite place. He dismissed the thought as paranoia, a side effect of the high stakes and long hours. He wasn't one to dwell on intangibles. Instead, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He checked his watch, time to regroup with his team and prepare for the afternoon session. The strategy was sound, the evidence solid. They had the upper hand, and Paul intended to keep it. Yet, as he walked back into the courtroom, he couldn't shake the flicker of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just about the case or Marcus Adler. There was something else lurking at the edges of his thoughts, something he couldn't quite define. The judge returned, and the proceedings resumed. Paul straightened in his chair, his composure unshaken, his mind locked onto the task at hand. He knew what was expected of him, victory at any cost. It was a mantra he'd lived by for years, one that had brought him everything he thought he wanted. And yet, as the hours ticked by and the arguments unfolded, he couldn't help but wonder, was it enough? The courtroom buzzed faintly around him, the cadence of lawyers' voices blending into an indistinct hum as Paul sat back in his chair. His attention drifted, pulled inward to the gnawing unease that had followed him since morning. The flash of Marcus Adler's smug smirk, the faint flicker of something he couldn't quite place, it all swirled together, opening a door to memories he'd worked so hard to close. He wasn't a man given to nostalgia. Memories were messy, unpredictable things, and Paul preferred control. But today, control slipped through his fingers like water. His thoughts strayed, unbidden, to Lauren. It had been 5 years since he'd seen her. 5 years since she'd packed her things, walked out of their penthouse, and left him standing in the doorway, silent and stunned. 5 years of burying the regret under endless workdays and strategic victories. But no matter how high he climbed, the ache of that moment remained lodged deep inside him, a silent testament to what he'd lost. Their story didn't end in fireworks or dramatic shouting matches. No, the end of their marriage had been quieter than that, more insidious. He could trace it back to the moments he hadn't noticed, the nights he came home too late to see her waiting, the mornings he left too early to share coffee. It had been a gradual erosion, a steady pull that frayed their connection thread by thread until there was nothing left to hold them together. He could still picture the day she left as if it were yesterday. He'd been in his office, pacing as he argued with a board member about a critical acquisition. The call had dragged on longer than expected, leaving Lauren waiting in the living room. When he finally emerged, he'd found her standing by the window, her suitcase by her side. "I can't do this anymore, Paul," she'd said, her voice quiet but firm. His first instinct had been to argue, to convince her to stay, but the look in her eyes stopped him. There had been too many broken promises, too many nights she'd fallen asleep alone while he chased his next victory. She wasn't angry, she was tired. And he couldn't blame her. "Lauren, we can fix this," he'd said, though even then, he'd known it wasn't true. The words felt hollow, a reflex more than anything. She shook her head. "You don't even see it, do you? I've been invisible to you for years. You're married to your company, not me." Her suitcase wheels clicked softly against the hardwood as she rolled it toward the door. He didn't move to stop her. He didn't know how. The months that followed were a blur. He threw himself into his work, burying the pain under spreadsheets and conference calls. His friends said it was his way of coping, but he knew better. It was avoidance, pure and simple. The silence of his empty apartment was too loud, and the thought of confronting his failure was unbearable. What stung most wasn't that she'd left but that he hadn't fought for her. He'd always been a fighter in business, ruthless and unyielding, but when it came to Lauren, he'd faltered. He'd let her walk away because deep down, he believed she deserved better. Someone who could give her the time and attention he never could. Paul exhaled slowly, his gaze unfocused. The courtroom's steady rhythm continued around him, oblivious to the storm inside his head. He shifted in his chair, trying to shake the memory loose, but it clung to him like a shadow. What would she think of him now? He'd achieved everything they dreamed of together and more, but at what cost? The penthouse was bigger, the accolades grander, the numbers in his bank account higher. And yet, as he sat there surrounded by lawyers and rivals, he felt hollow. He remembered the last thing she'd said to him before she walked out the door. I hope you find what you're looking for, Paul. I really do. At the time, her words had felt like an accusation, a reminder of all the ways he'd failed her. But now, years later, they felt more like a plea. A hope that he might find something beyond the endless climb, beyond the deals and the profits. The sound of a gavel snapped him back to the present. He blinked, realizing the courtroom had fallen silent. His attorney was looking at him expectantly, waiting for his signal to proceed. Paul nodded, the motion automatic, and the trial resumed. As the next argument unfolded, he pushed the memories back into their box, locking them away where they couldn't distract him. This wasn't the time to dwell on the past. He had a battle to win, a legacy to protect. But even as he forced his focus back to the case, a part of him couldn't help but wonder. Had Marcus Adler ever had to make those kinds of choices? Had he ever sacrificed something real for the sake of ambition? Paul clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. Whatever regrets he carried, they didn't matter now. The past was a lesson, not a life sentence. And if Marcus thought he could outmaneuver him, either in the courtroom or anywhere else, he was in for a rude awakening. Paul leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as the courtroom proceedings resumed. The earlier memories of Lauren still lingered at the edge of his mind, but he pushed them aside. There was no room for distraction here, not when so much was at stake. The gavel struck, and the judge nodded toward the attorneys to proceed. Across the aisle, Marcus Adler sat with his trademark smugness, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Paul had known Marcus for years, first as a competitor on the fringes of the industry, and then as a full-blown rival when Atlas Innovations began its aggressive rise. Their animosity had grown with every contested deal, every market share battle. Today, the stakes were higher than ever. The dispute centered on intellectual property. Atlas claimed Caldwell Enterprises had infringed on a patented algorithm integral to their new tech platform. Paul, of course, knew this was a calculated ploy, one designed to block his company's upcoming merger with a European giant. If the court ruled in favor of Atlas, it would cripple his expansion plans and give Marcus the upper hand. Paul's lead attorney, Miranda Foster, stood and began her argument, her tone steady and authoritative. She outlined how Caldwell Enterprises had developed its technology independently, how the timelines proved there was no infringement, and how Atlas's accusations were little more than a thinly veiled attempt to stifle competition. As she spoke, Paul watched Marcus. The other man's expression was carefully neutral, but his posture betrayed his confidence. He believed he had already won. When it was Atlas's turn to present, Marcus didn't leave the argument solely to his legal team. Instead, he rose, a calculated move that instantly commanded attention. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and controlled. "This case isn't just about intellectual property. It's about fairness. Caldwell Enterprises has a long history of pushing boundaries, often at the expense of smaller companies. My client, our company, represents a line that must not be crossed." Paul's jaw tightened as Marcus continued. He didn't believe for a second that Marcus cared about fairness. This wasn't about right or wrong, it was about winning. Marcus had always been the type to play dirty when it suited him, a man who cloaked ambition in lofty ideals. When Marcus finished, Paul signaled Miranda, who quickly requested permission to cross-examine him. The judge granted it, and Paul felt a flicker of satisfaction as Marcus returned to the stand. Now it was his turn to apply pressure. Miranda's questions were precise, designed to poke holes in Marcus's argument. But as she probed, Marcus's responses remained polished, each one layered with just enough plausible deniability to keep the case from tipping decisively in Paul's favor. Finally, Paul couldn't stay silent. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Mr. Adler," he said, his tone cold, "you've built your company on acquisitions and claims like these. Tell me, how many of those claims have held up under scrutiny?" There was a murmur in the courtroom, and Marcus's smirk faltered ever so slightly. He adjusted his tie, his calm facade cracking just enough for Paul to see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "I believe," Marcus replied, his voice measured, that the courts will decide the merit of this case. But if we're discussing histories, Mr. Caldwell, I think it's worth noting how many partnerships your company has strained, or destroyed, through aggressive tactics. The judge banged the gavel to maintain order, but the tension in the room was palpable. Paul could feel the eyes of the spectators on him, their interest piqued by the personal undercurrent in the exchange. This wasn't just about business. This was a clash of egos, of two men who had spent years trying to outmaneuver each other. As the day wore on, the arguments grew sharper. Atlas's attorneys presented reams of data, trying to prove their case, while Miranda expertly dismantled each point. Paul watched every move, every word, like a chess player anticipating the next play. He could see Marcus growing restless, his confidence beginning to waver as Caldwell Enterprises' defense gained ground. Still, there were moments when Marcus's smirk returned, a reminder that he wasn't out of the fight. During one of the breaks, Paul caught Marcus glancing his way, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Paul wondered if Marcus knew something he didn't, if there was a card he was holding back. But Paul didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Marcus thrived on doubt, on exploiting weaknesses. The only way to beat him was to stay unshakable, to project the same confidence that had carried Paul to the top of the industry. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the tension between the two men was thick enough to cut. Paul rose from his seat, adjusting his suit jacket as Marcus approached. "Good showing today," Marcus said, his tone light but laced with condescension. "Though I wonder if your team has the stamina for the long game." Paul met his gaze evenly. "We'll see who's standing when this is over," he replied, his voice steady. Marcus chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Oh, I'm sure we will. Enjoy your evening, Paul." As Marcus walked away, Paul felt the familiar churn of anger and determination in his chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He would see to it that Marcus paid for every smirk, every jab, every attempt to undermine Caldwell Enterprises. The stakes were too high for anything less. He stepped outside the courthouse, the cool air brushing against his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to let the day's tension ebb. But as he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye, Marcus exiting the building, a figure at his side. It took Paul a second to register what he was seeing. His breath caught, his pulse quickening. Walking beside Marcus, her arm looped through his, was Lauren. She was laughing, her face illuminated by a smile Paul hadn't seen in years. Her presence was as sharp and disorienting as a slap, dragging him back to a place he thought he'd buried. For the first time in years, Paul felt truly unsteady. He didn't move, didn't speak, as they walked past him and disappeared into the crowd. All he could do was stand there, frozen in shock, as the memory of Lauren's departure collided with the reality of her return, and the impossible connection to Marcus Adler. Paul's fists clenched at his sides, a storm brewing inside him. Whatever game Marcus was playing, this was personal now. Paul stood frozen on the courthouse steps, the chaos of the day's legal battle still simmering in his mind. The tension of the courtroom had left him weary, though he'd worn his composure like armor. Outside, the world felt quieter, the crisp air offering a brief reprieve from the weight of everything at stake. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to push the day's confrontations to the edges of his consciousness. But then he saw her. At first, he thought he was mistaken. The woman descending the steps alongside Marcus Adler couldn't possibly be Lauren. It had been years since he'd seen her, and his memories, though vivid, had grown unreliable with time. But as she drew closer, her laughter carrying on the breeze, there was no denying it. It was her. She was just as he remembered, poised, radiant, and effortlessly elegant. Her auburn hair caught the fading sunlight, and her smile, the one that once lit up his world, now illuminated the space between her and Marcus. She rested her hand lightly on Marcus's arm, the gesture casual yet intimate, and Paul's breath hitched. The scene hit him like a punch to the gut. Lauren here with him. Of all the people in the world, why Marcus? Why now? His mind raced, trying to piece together an explanation, but none of it made sense. The woman who had once shared his life, his dreams, his future, now stood beside his greatest rival, her presence a cruel twist in a game that had already felt too personal. Paul's body tensed, his jaw clenching as a wave of emotion surged through him. Shock, jealousy, and regret churned together in a storm he hadn't anticipated. He prided himself on control, on his ability to compartmentalize, to face any challenge without faltering. But this was different. This was Lauren. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was engrossed in whatever Marcus was saying, her expression animated, her laughter unguarded. It struck Paul how happy she looked, how completely at ease she seemed in Marcus's presence. It was a stark contrast to the memories he held of their final days together, her face lined with exhaustion, her voice tinged with disappointment, her spirit dulled by the life they had built but couldn't sustain. Paul wanted to look away, to retreat before she saw him, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't tear his eyes from her, even as each moment intensified the ache in his chest. He'd spent years convincing himself that he'd moved on, that the void she left had been filled by his success, his empire. But now, seeing her again, he realized just how wrong he'd been. When she finally glanced in his direction, their eyes met. Her smile faltered for a brief second, surprise flickering across her features before she quickly recovered. She said something to Marcus, who turned to follow her gaze, his expression shifting into one of calculated amusement. "Paul!" Marcus called out, his tone overly friendly, bordering on smug. "Didn't expect to see you still here." Paul straightened, masking his turmoil behind a neutral expression. "Marcus," he replied, his voice steady but cold. His gaze shifted to Lauren, who stood silently at Marcus's side, her eyes unreadable. Marcus gestured toward her, his smirk deepening. "I don't believe you've had the pleasure of meeting Lauren." He paused, the deliberate phrasing twisting the knife. "Well, maybe I should say reuniting. Small world, isn't it?" Paul's stomach tightened, but he refused to let Marcus see the impact of his words. Instead, he turned to Lauren, his voice softening despite himself. "Hello, Lauren." "Hello, Paul," she replied, her tone polite but distant. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe, or hesitation, but she didn't elaborate. Marcus, ever the opportunist, filled the silence. "Lauren's been a tremendous help to me these past few months. Couldn't ask for a better advisor, really. Her insights have been invaluable." Paul's jaw tightened. The implications were clear, but he refused to take the bait. Instead, he nodded curtly. "She's always been exceptional at what she does." Lauren shifted uncomfortably, her hands slipping from Marcus's arm. "It's been a long day," she said, her voice measured. "We should probably get going." "Of course," Marcus agreed, though his eyes lingered on Paul, savoring the moment. "I'll see you in court tomorrow, Paul. Best of luck." Paul didn't respond, his focus entirely on Lauren as she turned to leave. For a brief second, he considered calling out to her, asking her to stay, to explain. But what would he say? What could he possibly offer now that he hadn't been able to give her then? As they disappeared into the crowd, Paul stood motionless, the weight of their encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. The sight of her with Marcus was more than a blow to his ego. It was a reminder of everything he'd lost, not just in his marriage but in himself. He thought of the nights he'd spent alone in his penthouse, the silence a constant companion. He thought of the mornings when he'd stared at the empty side of the bed, pretending it didn't bother him. He thought of the moments he told himself it was all worth it, that the sacrifices he'd made were necessary for the life he built. But now, as the image of Lauren's smile lingered in his mind, those justifications felt hollow. The empire he'd created, the power he wielded, none of it could fill the void she'd left behind. Paul exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool evening air. He straightened his tie, his resolve hardening. Marcus might have won this round, but the game wasn't over. Paul had built his success on resilience, on his ability to adapt, to fight back. This time would be no different. And yet, as he walked away from the courthouse, his mind was no longer solely on the case. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder, what if? Paul spent the next day trying to focus on the courtroom proceedings, but his mind constantly wandered to the encounter outside the courthouse. He could still see Lauren, her hand resting lightly on Marcus's arm, her laughter ringing in his ears. It gnawed at him, an unwelcome distraction that he couldn't shake. The day's hearing was intense, with arguments volleyed back and forth. Paul kept his composure, making notes and directing his team with precision, but there was an edge to him, a restlessness that even his lead attorney, Miranda, noticed. "Are you all right?" she asked during a brief recess, her voice low. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," he said curtly, though his tight tone betrayed him. "Let's focus on the case." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The case wasn't the only battle he was fighting. When the day finally adjourned, Paul stepped out of the courthouse, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. The crowd had thinned, leaving only a few stragglers lingering near the steps. He was reaching for his car keys when a voice stopped him cold. "Paul!" He turned to see Marcus approaching, Lauren by his side. Her presence was just as jarring as the day before, but this time, he was braced for it. Marcus, however, seemed entirely too pleased with himself. "Thought we'd catch you before you disappeared," Marcus said, his tone friendly but laced with something sharper. "Lauren and I were just talking about how strange it is, the three of us crossing paths like this. Feels almost serendipitous." Paul's jaw tightened, but he forced a neutral expression. "Is that what you'd call it?" Marcus chuckled, seemingly oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Why not? Life has a funny way of bringing people together. Don't you think, Lauren?" Lauren smiled politely, but there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes as she glanced at Paul. "It's certainly unexpected," she said softly. Paul met her gaze, searching for something, regret, an explanation, anything, but her expression gave nothing away. He looked back at Marcus, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want, Marcus?" Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Paul. I'm not here to start another fight. Quite the opposite, actually." He glanced at Lauren, a sly grin tugging at his lips. "Lauren and I were thinking it might be nice to clear the air, so to speak. The three of us." Paul frowned, his instincts immediately on high alert. "What are you suggesting?" "A dinner," Marcus said smoothly. "Nothing formal, just a chance for us to talk. I'm sure there's plenty we could discuss, both professionally and otherwise." Paul's eyes narrowed. The idea of sitting across a table from Marcus, and from Lauren, felt like a trap, a power play designed to put him on edge. But before he could refuse, Lauren spoke. "I think it's a good idea," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's been a long time, Paul. Maybe it's time we had a conversation." Her words hung in the air, cutting through his resistance. There was something in her voice, an undercurrent of sincerity, that made it impossible for him to dismiss the suggestion outright. Still, the thought of it unsettled him. What could they possibly talk about that wouldn't open old wounds or fan the flames of his rivalry with Marcus? "I don't think that's necessary," Paul said, his voice clipped. Lauren's gaze softened, and for a moment, he saw a glimpse of the woman he'd once known, the one who could always disarm him with a single look. "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But it might be helpful." Paul hesitated, torn between his instincts and the pull of her words. He didn't want to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing him squirm, but he also couldn't ignore the part of him that wanted answers, closure, something to make sense of this twisted situation. Marcus, sensing the hesitation, grinned. "Come on, Paul. What's the harm? Worst case, it's an awkward dinner. Best case, we leave with a better understanding of each other. Isn't that what grown-ups do?" Paul resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Marcus's condescension was infuriating, but Lauren's presence tempered his reaction. He glanced at her again, searching her expression for some sign of her intentions. She looked back at him, calm and composed, but he could see the tension in the way she held herself. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Fine. One dinner." Marcus clapped his hands together, his satisfaction unmistakable. Perfect. I'll have my assistant set it up. Tomorrow night work for you? Paul nodded stiffly, his mind already racing with the implications of what he'd just agreed to. He wasn't sure what Marcus hoped to achieve with this charade, but he wasn't about to let himself be blindsided. If Marcus wanted to play games, Paul would make sure he was ready. As Marcus and Lauren turned to leave, Lauren glanced back over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Paul watched them disappear into the crowd, his thoughts a whirlwind of anticipation and unease. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as Paul replayed the encounter in his mind. Lauren's presence stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years, a mix of longing and regret that he couldn't quite shake. And Marcus's smugness was enough to make his blood boil. By the time he reached his penthouse, he was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting between the past and the future. Tomorrow's dinner loomed ahead like a storm cloud, and for the first time in years, Paul felt truly unprepared. What could he say to Lauren after all this time? What did she see in Marcus? And most troubling of all, what was she hoping to accomplish by bringing them together? As the hours ticked by, Paul resolved to face whatever came next with the same determination he brought to every battle. He might not have all the answers, but he wouldn't let Marcus, or anyone else, see him falter. Whatever tomorrow held, Paul would be ready. Or so he told himself. Paul arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early, a rare occurrence for a man who often treated time as negotiable. It wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented, too casual, too trendy, but it had Marcus's fingerprints all over it. A modern bistro with exposed brick walls, dim lighting, and a menu curated to impress. Marcus wanted to control the atmosphere, and Paul was already regretting agreeing to this charade. The hostess guided him to a corner table, secluded enough for privacy but open enough to invite attention. Typical Marcus, he thought. Always playing to an audience, even when there wasn't one. Paul sat, checking his watch. He wasn't sure what he dreaded more, the awkwardness of seeing Lauren again in this setting or the smug satisfaction he knew would radiate off Marcus. Either way, he resolved to keep his composure. If this was a power play, he wouldn't let Marcus win. They arrived together, Marcus leading the way with his usual swagger. Lauren followed, her steps more measured but just as assured. She looked striking in a sleek black dress, understated but elegant. Paul couldn't help but notice the small details, the way her hair framed her face, the way her eyes scanned the room as if she were assessing its every corner. It was a habit she'd always had, one he'd found endearing when they were together. "Paul," Marcus greeted, extending his hand as if they were old friends. "Glad you could make it." Paul shook his hand firmly, his expression unreadable. "Marcus." "Lauren." Lauren offered a polite smile. "Paul." They took their seats, Marcus beside Lauren and across from Paul. The air between them was charged, though Marcus seemed oblivious to the undercurrent. Or maybe he wasn't. Paul couldn't tell if his rival was playing the fool or orchestrating the entire evening with deliberate precision. The server arrived, taking drink orders and leaving behind menus. Marcus launched into small talk, commenting on the wine list and cracking a joke about the traffic. Lauren smiled politely, occasionally chiming in, but Paul stayed quiet, his gaze flickering between them as he tried to gauge their dynamic. "So, Paul," Marcus said after a few minutes, leaning back in his chair, "it's not every day we get to sit across the table from the great Paul Caldwell. Must be nice to take a break from conquering the world." Paul smiled thinly. "I could say the same about you, Marcus. Though I imagine you're more comfortable conquering small markets." Lauren's brow furrowed slightly, her gaze darting to Paul before settling on Marcus. If she picked up on the tension, she didn't address it. "I have to admit," Marcus said undeterred, "having Lauren on my team has been a game-changer. She has this incredible ability to see things from angles I never considered. Isn't that right, Lauren?" Lauren shifted slightly in her seat, her expression calm but guarded. "I try to be helpful." Paul couldn't help himself. "You've always been more than helpful, Lauren. Your insight was invaluable when we were building Caldwell Enterprises Foundation. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Sounds like you had quite the partnership. Paul's gaze hardened, and for a moment, the weight of unspoken history hung heavily between them. Lauren broke the silence, her voice measured. Paul and I worked well together for a time. But sometimes, people need to take different paths. Her words stung, not because they weren't true but because they carried a finality that Paul wasn't ready to accept. He studied her, searching for any hint of regret or lingering affection, but she gave nothing away. The conversation shifted to the case, with Marcus making thinly veiled comments about the stakes and the strategies he believed Caldwell Enterprises might employ. Paul countered with equally measured remarks, but the back and forth felt like a sparring match disguised as civility. Lauren mostly observed, occasionally steering the conversation towards safer topics. But when the main courses arrived, she turned to Paul, her tone softening. Paul, I hope you know I hold no resentment about the past. What happened between us was difficult, but I think we both did the best we could at the time. Paul felt the words land like a blow. They were gracious, even kind, but they carried an edge of finality that left him unsettled. I'm glad you feel that way, he said carefully. Though I can't say I've stopped wondering if I could have done better. Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, her composure wavered. We both made mistakes. But life moves forward, doesn't it? Before Paul could respond, Marcus interjected. It's true. Lauren's been instrumental in helping me move forward with Atlas. It's amazing what a fresh perspective can do. The words were innocuous enough, but Paul heard the subtext. Marcus was staking a claim, not just on Lauren's professional contributions but on her as a person. It made Paul's blood boil, though he kept his face impassive. That's one thing we agree on, Paul said coolly. Lauren's perspective is one of a kind. Lauren glanced between them, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. This isn't a competition, she said, her tone firm. We're here to have a conversation, not to score points. The reprimand landed, and both men backed off slightly, though the tension lingered. As the evening wore on, the conversation returned to safer territory, but Paul's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Lauren's words, about the way Marcus spoke about her as if she were a prize to be won. When the check arrived, Marcus picked it up without hesitation. My treat, he said with a grin. Consider it a gesture of goodwill. Paul smiled thinly, his gratitude insincere. How generous. As they stood to leave, Lauren touched Paul's arm lightly, her gaze meeting his. It was good to see you, Paul. I mean that. He nodded, his throat tight. You too, Lauren. Marcus placed a hand on Lauren's back as they walked out together, his confidence radiating like a beacon. Paul watched them go, his emotions a whirlwind of regret, jealousy, and determination. This wasn't over, not with Marcus, and certainly not with Lauren. Paul didn't know what the next move was, but one thing was clear, he wasn't about to let Marcus Adler walk away with everything. Paul returned to his penthouse that night feeling drained, his thoughts a turbulent mix of anger, regret, and determination. The dinner had been a circus, orchestrated by Marcus to rattle him. It had worked, he wouldn't deny that, but it had also reignited a fire he hadn't felt in years. Marcus had underestimated him, and Paul was determined to make him regret it. The next morning, Paul was in his office before dawn, the city's skyline barely illuminated by the first hints of sunlight. His team wasn't surprised by the early start. They knew him well enough to recognize the signs. When Paul Caldwell became this focused, something big was on the horizon. Cancel my meetings for today, Paul instructed his assistant, Amanda, as she entered with his coffee. I need to focus on the case and the merger. Amanda hesitated for a moment. You've got a call with the European board at 10. Are you sure you want to reschedule? Paul looked up from his notes, his expression sharp. Reschedule it. This takes priority. She nodded, retreating quietly. Paul turned his attention back to the documents spread across his desk. He'd spent years building Caldwell Enterprises into a powerhouse, and he wasn't about to let Marcus Adler or anyone else undermine that. The stakes were higher than ever, not just for the company but for his pride, his legacy. Hours passed in a blur as Paul pored over every detail of the case. He reviewed past acquisitions, legal precedents, and the intricacies of the merger Marcus was so desperate to disrupt. He called in his legal team, grilling them on their strategy and demanding alternatives where he saw weaknesses. Every move Marcus had made so far had been calculated, but Paul wasn't just reacting anymore. He was planning his counterattack. By midday, he'd formulated a strategy that left his team cautiously optimistic and him quietly confident. It wasn't just about defending against Atlas's claims. It was about turning the tables entirely. Paul's plan was bold, aggressive, and risky, the kind of move that had defined his career and kept him at the top. But as the adrenaline of strategy faded, a quieter thought crept into his mind. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as Lauren's words from the night before echoed in his head. Sometimes people need to take different paths. It wasn't just her presence with Marcus that bothered him, though that stung more than he'd admit. It was the realization that, despite everything he'd accomplished, he still felt like something was missing. He'd always assumed success would fill the void she left, but now he wasn't so sure. For the first time in years, Paul allowed himself to question whether his relentless ambition had truly been worth the cost. The thought lingered as he left the office that evening, his steps slower than usual as he walked through the city streets. He wasn't headed home, he needed space, a chance to clear his head away from the sterile perfection of his penthouse. He found himself at a small coffee shop tucked into a quiet corner of the city, a place he hadn't visited in years. It had been one of Lauren's favorites. They used to come here on lazy Sunday mornings, sharing quiet moments over lattes and scones before the whirlwind of their week began. The familiarity of the place felt like a balm, even as it stirred old memories. As he waited for his coffee, a voice behind him broke through his thoughts. "I didn't expect to see you here." Paul turned to find Lauren standing a few feet away, a look of mild surprise on her face. She wasn't dressed for a dinner with Marcus this time. Her outfit was simple, her demeanor more relaxed. It was the Lauren he remembered, unguarded and approachable. "Lauren," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I didn't know you still came here." She smiled faintly. Not often. I was meeting a friend nearby and thought I'd stop in. It's been a long time." "It has," he agreed, gesturing to the table by the window. "Do you have time to sit?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." They settled into the corner table, the same one they used to favor. For a while, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history filling the silence. Finally, Lauren broke the tension. "You seem different, Paul," she said, studying him. "Not as sharp-edged as I remember." He chuckled dryly. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an observation." "A bit of both," she admitted, her gaze softening. "I saw how you handled last night. You could have escalated things with Marcus, but you didn't. That's not the Paul the first knew." He looked down at his coffee, the steam rising in delicate spirals. "Maybe the Paul you knew realized he made too many mistakes." Lauren's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "That's unexpected to hear." He met her eyes, his tone earnest. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened between us, Lauren. I was so focused on building something bigger than myself that I didn't see what I was losing until it was gone. You deserve better." Her lips pressed together, and for a moment she looked away. "It wasn't all on you, Paul. I could have fought harder, been more patient. But I think we both knew something had to give. We just didn't realize it would be us." The admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Paul felt a pang of regret, but also a strange sense of relief. The conversation they were having now was one they should have had years ago. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Lauren sighed, her gaze distant. "Sometimes. But other times, I think it was necessary. You've accomplished so much, Paul. Maybe this was the only way you could." "I'm not so sure anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The honesty between them was disarming, and for the first time in years, Paul felt like he wasn't wearing a mask. They talked for nearly an hour, sharing fragments of their lives since the divorce. Lauren spoke about her work with Marcus, her plans to eventually branch out on her own, and the things she'd learned about herself along the way. When they finally parted, Paul felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. But he also felt more determined than ever. Lauren's presence reminded him of what he'd lost, but it also gave him clarity about what he still had to fight for, not just in the courtroom but in himself. The path ahead wasn't just about defeating Marcus. It was about proving, to himself and maybe even to Lauren, that he was capable of more than ambition. Paul Caldwell was ready to rebuild, not just his strategy, but the man he wanted to be. The courtroom was tense, the air heavy with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Paul sat at the defense table, his expression calm but his mind racing. Weeks of preparation, strategy, and long nights had led to this moment. Caldwell Enterprises had fought hard against Atlas's claims, and while Paul had confidence in his team, he knew nothing was guaranteed. He glanced across the aisle at Marcus Adler, who sat with an air of feigned nonchalance. The man was a master of masks, but Paul could see the slight rigidity in his posture, the way his hand tapped absently against the arm of his chair. Marcus was nervous, though he'd never admit it. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice steady and deliberate. The court finds in favor of Caldwell Enterprises on the primary claim of intellectual property infringement. However, on the secondary claim regarding trade practices, the court rules in favor of Atlas Innovations. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't a complete victory, but it wasn't a loss either. Paul knew immediately what the ruling meant. Caldwell Enterprises could move forward with its merger plans, though some concessions would have to be made. Marcus had managed to land a small blow, but the larger victory was Paul's. Marcus stood, offering Paul a tight smile as he approached. "Well played, Paul," he said, extending his hand. "Looks like you lived to fight another day." Paul shook his hand, his grip firm. "Same to you, Marcus. I'm sure this won't be the last time." Marcus chuckled, though there was a hint of frustration in his eyes. He had underestimated Paul, and they both knew it. Without another word, Marcus turned and left, his entourage following close behind. Paul exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest finally beginning to ease. His team gathered around him, congratulating him on the outcome, but his focus drifted toward the back of the courtroom. Lauren was standing there, watching him with an unreadable expression. He excused himself from his team and approached her. As he neared, she gave him a small, warm smile. "Congratulations, Paul," she said, her voice soft. "It's not every day you see Marcus Adler walk out of a courtroom looking that humbled." Paul smiled faintly. "It's a rare sight, isn't it? I'm glad you stayed. I wanted to see how it ended," she admitted. "And I thought we should talk." He nodded, motioning toward a quieter corner of the courthouse hallway. Once they were away from the lingering crowd, he turned to her, his expression sincere. "Lauren, I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night. About how people take different paths. I've spent so much time chasing success, trying to prove something to the world, that I forgot what really mattered. I forgot who really mattered." Her eyes softened, but she didn't interrupt. "I don't know if I ever told you this," he continued, "but I always admired you. Your intelligence, your strength, the way you saw things I never could. Losing you made me realize how much I took those things for granted. I needed to say that. To apologize." Lauren looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Paul, you don't owe me an apology. We both made mistakes. But I appreciate you saying it." He nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I know I can't change the past, and I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I see things more clearly now." She smiled, a hint of sadness mingled with warmth. "You've changed, Paul. I can see it. And I think you're starting to find something you've been looking for, even if you didn't realize it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the courthouse a distant backdrop. Finally, Lauren spoke again. "I'm glad we had this chance to talk. To close some of the gaps." "Me too," Paul said quietly. "Thank you for that." She gave him one last smile before stepping away. "Take care of yourself, Paul. And try not to work so hard. Life's too short." "I'll do my best," he replied, watching as she walked toward the exit. Paul lingered for a moment, his thoughts surprisingly calm. For years, he'd carried the weight of their past, the regret of what he'd lost. But now, there was something new, a sense of resolution, of peace. Lauren wasn't coming back into his life, but that was okay. This wasn't about reclaiming what was gone, it was about moving forward. When he finally stepped outside, the sun was shining, the air crisp and clear. The courthouse steps felt lighter beneath his feet this time, as if he were walking away from more than just a courtroom. He was walking away from the ghosts of his past, from the relentless need to prove himself at all costs. As he reached the curb, he glanced back briefly, catching sight of Lauren through the window of a cab. She was looking at him, a faint smile on her lips, before the car pulled away and disappeared into the city. Paul turned back to the street, his shoulders straight, his steps steady. There was still work to do, deals to close, challenges to face, but for the first time in years, he wasn't chasing something intangible. He was ready to focus on what truly mattered, building a life that balanced ambition with meaning. The future stretched out before him, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Paul Caldwell was looking forward to it. Certainly. Here's an additional part where Paul decides to pursue Lauren and win her back, blending it seamlessly with the previous narrative and taking it around 1,100 words. Paul sat in his office, the soft glow of city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The legal victory should have filled him with satisfaction, but his mind kept drifting back to Lauren. Their conversation at the courthouse had left him with a sense of closure, but it hadn't quieted the part of him that still wanted her in his life. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder, what if it wasn't too late? Lauren's words replayed in his mind, "Life's too short." She hadn't said it casually. There was meaning behind it, perhaps even a challenge. Paul realized he didn't want to move forward with only the memory of her. He wanted the real thing. And for the first time, he was ready to fight, not with ambition or ego, but with vulnerability. The decision was made before he even realized it. He grabbed his phone and dialed Amanda, his assistant. "Amanda, I need to rearrange tomorrow's schedule," he said. "Cancel my meetings and block off the afternoon." There was a pause. "Everything?" "That includes the merger review." "Everything," he said firmly. "I need to take care of something personal." The next morning, Paul arrived at the address he'd managed to get through a quiet favor from a mutual acquaintance. Lauren's consultancy office was located in a charming brick building on a tree-lined street, the kind of place that exuded warmth and professionalism. It fit her perfectly. Paul stepped inside, his nerves uncharacteristically frayed. The receptionist looked up, startled by his presence. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, clearly recognizing him. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," he admitted, offering a small smile. "But I was hoping Lauren might have a moment." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. After a hushed exchange, she gestured toward a door down the hall. "She'll see you." Paul thanked her and walked toward the office, his pulse quickening with each step. When he reached the door, he knocked lightly, and Lauren's voice called out, "Come in." She looked up from her desk as he entered, her surprise evident. "Paul," she said, setting down her pen. "This is unexpected." He closed the door behind him, his expression earnest. "I know. But I needed to see you." Lauren gestured toward the chair across from her, and he sat, feeling strangely out of place in a setting that was entirely hers. "I thought we'd said everything we needed to say," she said gently, though her tone wasn't unkind. "I thought so too," Paul admitted. "But I was wrong." Lauren, our conversation at the courthouse, it made me realize something. I've spent years chasing the wrong things. I convinced myself that success would make up for everything I'd lost, but it hasn't. And I don't think it ever will. She leaned back slightly, studying him. What are you saying, Paul? Lauren's expression softened, but there was caution in her eyes. Paul, this isn't easy for me to hear. I've spent a long time rebuilding myself after we fell apart. I've found a sense of independence I didn't have before. I know, he said quickly. And I don't want to take that away from you. I'm not asking you to pick up where we left off. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can be better. That we can be better. She was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on him. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured. Paul, you're saying all the right things, but words aren't enough. What's changed? Why now? He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Because I finally understand what I lost. Not just you, but the balance you brought to my life. I was so consumed by my ambition that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. But losing you, it forced me to look at myself in a way I never had before. I've had to face the fact that success means nothing if I don't have someone to share it with. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. Paul, this is a lot to process. I won't deny that hearing this means something to me, but I need time. I need to know this isn't just about the past or the fact that Marcus and I are working together. It's not about Marcus, he said firmly. It's about you. And I'll wait as long as you need. Lauren smiled faintly, a mix of warmth and skepticism. You've never been good at waiting. Then maybe it's time I learned, he said with a small smile of his own. She stood, signaling that the conversation was over for now. Paul rose as well, his heart heavy but hopeful. Thank you for hearing me out, he said. I'll leave you to your work. As he turned to go, her voice stopped him. Paul. He looked back, and she met his eyes. Don't just say you've changed. Show me. He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. I will. Over the next few weeks, Paul kept his promise. He didn't bombard her with calls or grand gestures. Instead, he focused on making the changes he'd spoken of, not just for her but for himself. He scaled back his work hours, delegated more responsibilities, and even took a weekend off, a first in years. Slowly, he began to feel the balance he'd been missing. Lauren noticed. Their paths crossed occasionally, at industry events, mutual gatherings, and each time, she saw a different side of him. He was still driven, still ambitious, but there was a newfound humility in him, a quiet determination that spoke louder than words. One evening, as Paul was leaving his office, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Lauren. Dinner next week? Your turn to pick the place. He smiled, his heart lifting. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a step. A chance. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers. Paul put his phone away and walked out into the night, the city alive around him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, on the right path, with hope guiding the way. The restaurant buzzed with quiet energy, the soft clink of glasses and murmured conversations filling the air. Paul sat at their reserved table, his heart racing as he waited for Lauren. It had been weeks of tentative progress, dinners, long talks, and moments that felt like the echoes of something they had once shared. But tonight felt different. Lauren walked in, her expression calm but serious, and Paul immediately knew this wasn't just another dinner. She approached the table, sliding into the seat across from him with a grace that still left him breathless. There's something I need to tell you, she said, her tone steady. Paul nodded, bracing himself. I ended things with Marcus, she continued, her words clear and deliberate. It wasn't a dramatic breakup or anything like that. I realized that what we had, it wasn't right. I was holding on to something safe, not something real. Paul's breath hitched, but he kept his expression neutral. Lauren, you don't owe me an explanation. I do, she said, her eyes locking onto his. Because I didn't leave him just for me. I left because I couldn't keep ignoring what I feel when I'm with you. You've changed, Paul, and so have I. But somehow, through all of it, we've found our way back to this. He exhaled, relief flooding through him. I don't want to let you down, Lauren. Not again. I've spent so much time learning what I did wrong, and I'm ready to be better, not just for you, but for us. She smiled softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Then let's find out together. One step at a time. The weight of years lifted in that moment, replaced by a quiet, steady hope. They weren't the same people who had fallen apart years ago, but that was the point. They were ready to build something new, stronger, wiser, and together. And this time, Paul vowed, he wouldn't let anything come between them.
Thank you for watching this emotional story here on the True Crime Studio. This tale reminds us that success means little without love and connection, and it's never too late to make things right. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the True Crime Studio for more incredible stories. See you in the next video.